Good evening and welcome to tonight's event. I'm Victor Bailey, Director of the Hall Center for the Humanities. We're delighted to present this evening Virginia Scharff, who comes to us courtesy of the Organization of American Historians Distinguished Lectureship Program, which is a speakers bureau dedicated to American history. Perhaps I should also say, please turn off your various devices. The event tonight is co-sponsored by the Hall Center's Gender Seminar. The seminar has already put Professor Scharff to work with an early afternoon conversation. Professor Scharff will take questions after her talk. Please use the standing mics in the two aisles to ask your question. Afterwards, there's a reception for the guest speaker, who will also do a book signing, so please do join us afterwards. The person who first brought tonight's speaker to our attention was Kim Warren. It's appropriate for that reason and other reasons that she should be called upon to introduce Virginia Scharff. Kim Warren is Associate Professor of U.S. Women's History at KU. She has a BA from Yale, a PhD from Stanford. Her research interests include the history of race and gender in American education. Her publications include The Quest for Citizenship, African American and Native American Education in Kansas, published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2010. She's also the co-editor of the first and the forced Essays on the Native American and African American Experience, an online collection of essays resulting from research conducted with the support of a Ford Foundation grant. Her second book-length project is an investigation of Mary McLeod Bethune's political strategies to advance the movements of women and African Americans in the early 20th century, which was recently supported by a postdoctoral fellowship from the Woodrow Wilson Fellowship Foundation. So please welcome my very good colleague, Professor Kim Warren.
Thank you, Victor, for that very kind introduction and for bestowing on me the honor of introducing tonight's special guest, Dr. Virginia Scharff, historian and author of many books, including the one that she will discuss tonight, The Women Jefferson Loved. It's fitting that Dr. Scharff is with us the week that marks the 40th anniversary of a student and faculty occupation of a KU building that started on a cold and snowy night in February of 1972. That takeover was peaceful yet steadfast, and the brave women who formed the core of the protest, the February Sisters, made demands of KU's administration to improve female experiences with childcare, pay equity, women's health, and scholarly endeavors. Those demands were met, including the establishment of a women's studies program, which to this day continues to examine women, gender, and sexuality studies, identify faculty engaged in rigorous research on these topics, and more recently, it welcomed its first class of brand new PhD students. Although the women that Thomas Jefferson loved might not have envisioned a world that could generate such resolute yet nonviolent protest in 1972, especially in the context of their own revolution and nation-building project, they did foster in Jefferson, as Professor Scharff's book points out, and she'll point out tonight, they did foster in Jefferson his fierce need to fortify a foundation of liberty in the young nation of the United States of America. So again, I'm glad that Dr. Scharff's visit coincides with this 40th anniversary, and I appreciate all of the efforts that faculty and staff have put into organizing events this week. So let me just say one quick thing. I'd like to acknowledge the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies program and the Hall Center for the gender seminar that was mentioned earlier, and especially thank Professor Ann Schofield for facilitating today's seminar and lunch. And of course, a huge thank you goes to the staff of the Hall Center for the Humanities for coordinating and sponsoring tonight's talk, especially Dr. Victor Bailey, Samantha Bishop, Sally Utek, Jeannie Wolfcole, and others. And then finally, let me thank all of you for coming out tonight for the talk. Our guest tonight, as you know, is Dr. Virginia Scharff, a distinguished professor of history at the University of New Mexico. She is an incredibly productive scholar and teacher who has shaped the development of many fields, including environmental and women's history, as well as the American West. She directs the Center for the Southwest at the University of New Mexico. She chairs the Women in the West Project at the Autry National Center, and is a fellow of the Society of American Historians, as well as a distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians. Her academic honors also include fellowships at the Huntington Library and Monticello, as well as being named a Beinecke Research Fellow in the Lamar Center for the Frontiers and Borders at Yale University. She's also served as president of the Western Historical Association. But before achieving so many honors and positions of influence within the scholarly world, I should mention that Virginia Scharff was a pioneer in her own right, as one of the first female undergraduates admitted to Yale when it moved from an all-male institution to a coeducational university. From Yale, she earned a bachelor's degree in American Studies and then went on to earn a master's degree in journalism from the University of California at Berkeley and a master's degree in history from the University of Wyoming. It was at the University of Arizona that Dr. Scharff earned her PhD in history. A prolific scholar, Virginia Scharff has written several important books about the American West, including Taking the Wheel, Women and the Coming of the Motor Age, published in 1991, and 20,000 Roads, Women Movement in the West, published in 2003, and a co-authored volume, Homelands, How Women Made the West, published in 2010. That body of scholarship has had far-reaching influence and has helped us think about how the gendered aspects of the environment have shaped people's experiences of the Western United States and how women's movement and their relationships to the land and home in particular have shaped the West. In addition, she has published a groundbreaking edited volume of essays called Seeing Nature Through Gender, published in 2003, which forever shifted the fields of both gender studies and environmental studies by fusing the two together. Oh, in her spare time, she has also managed to publish 4 mystery novels. And if you're looking for these fantastic stories about a character named Mustang Sally, you'll have to search under her pseudonym, Virginia Swift. So tonight, Dr. Scharff will speak to us about Thomas Jefferson, or more specifically, about the women that he dearly loved and who loved him. The book, The Women Jefferson Loved, is the first major study of Jefferson's female relatives and intimate companions. Dr. Scharff's book is a multi-pronged examination of 4 generations of Jefferson's relatives, most notably his mother, Jane Randolph Jefferson, his wife and mother of 6 children, who was Martha Wales Skelton Jefferson, Sally Hemings, his African-American concubine and mother of 7 children, and then his daughters, Martha Patsy Jefferson Randolph and Mary Polly Jefferson Epps, and then of course the Jefferson granddaughters. In addition to being an incredibly well-researched book, and this was a difficult thing to do, since the Jefferson family embraced a long tradition of burning private letters and purging their own records in order to shape their public history. Despite that, this book is a wonderful read. It offers a fresh take on our 3rd president, a man deeply committed to engineering stability for both his family and his nation, as they both emerged out of years of violent revolution. By intersecting Jefferson's private and public lives, Dr. Scharff reveals the depth of Jefferson's love for those around him and how his deep affections inspired his immortal embrace of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Scharff's Jefferson, if you haven't read this book, you should. Scharff's Jefferson is a brilliant and also complicated person, and the women are equally influential and complex. And I believe Dr. Scharff will share some of these details with us tonight, but I do want to say one more thing about her scholarship, and I hope I'm not stealing any thunder by highlighting Scharff's portrayal of Sally Hemings in this book. A person often ignored or at best misunderstood by other historians, the Hemings that Scharff introduces us to is deeply human. As a young teenager, she was an enslaved woman who survived the responsibilities and challenges of taking care of Jefferson's daughters, but she was also someone who was intellectually capable of learning some French and making important choices for herself while she accompanied the Jeffersons in Europe. According to Scharff, Hemings influenced Jefferson, but she also made negotiations with him, including sacrificing the freedom that she legally experienced in France by returning to Virginia with Jefferson in exchange for the freedom of future children born from their unions. Details such as these are rich in Scharff's scholarship, and even the comprehensive family tree that Scharff has created at the beginning of the book. She's placed it at the beginning of the book. This is new, and it's a really helpful aid in tracking the progeny born of marital and non-marital unions, as well as the fact that not one, not two, but 3 generations of Jefferson men had liaisons with 3 generations of Hemings women. Some might find this aspect of the book puzzling or even troubling, as Scharff warns us, but the Hemings are essential to Jefferson's story, and Dr. Scharff paints a portrait of them as caring and loyal people who showed dedication to the Jefferson family over and over again. Equally important in this study, of course, are Jefferson's mother, wife, daughters, and granddaughters. But Virginia Scharff can do this significant history much more justice than I can. So I'll conclude by asking you to give a very warm welcome to Dr. Scharff.
Thank you so much, Kim. I am thrilled to be here. Kim mentioned that I got my PhD at the University of Arizona, and my mentor was Karen Anderson, who was a native of Lawrence, Kansas, and a graduate of KU. And I think it was maybe her dream for me that I would someday get to spend a couple days in Lawrence, if not more. And I have had a wonderful time. I got here yesterday. I thank you. I understand it's always sunny and warm here in Lawrence, and I have experienced your abundant hospitality. I want to thank Victor Bailey, the director of the Hall Center, and Jeannie Wolfkuhl, and the whole staff at the Hall Center have made me so extremely welcome. I want to thank Kim Warren for the invitation. One of the first conversations I had about this book was in Kim's seminar, where I flashed in on Skype. And it was the first time I'd ever taught on Skype, and it was a wonderful experience. Great students. I want to thank Ann Schofield for hosting me today with the gender seminar. All of you, thank you so very much for having me here. Now, I did notice that one of the pieces of publicity, I can't remember exactly which one, for this talk said Thomas Jefferson and his lovers. And I thought, ooh, that'll bring them in, you know? That's great, you know? Because, of course, everybody wants to know about Thomas Jefferson's sex life. And everybody always has ever since he had one. Truly. And a title like The Women Jefferson Loved invites you to imagine that that's the kind of talk this is going to be, but I'm going to disappoint you, I'm afraid, because I'm more interested in his head and his heart than maybe other parts of his body. And I believe that the best way to understand what made Thomas Jefferson tick is to think about and to learn about and to investigate the lives, to take a close look at the women he loved. And as Kim mentioned, this is his mother, Jane Randolph Jefferson, his wife, Martha Wales Skelton Jefferson, his concubine or mistress, Sally Hemings, and his daughters. The ones who lived to adulthood were Patsy Jefferson, Martha Patsy Jefferson Randolph, Mary or Polly Jefferson Epps, Harriet Hemings, and then his granddaughters, who were mostly Randolphs, and we don't know whether he had Hemings granddaughters. I guess he did have some Hemings granddaughters that we do know about, because they're now engaging in reunions with some of the Jefferson descendants. Now, the first thing I want to tell you about these women is that, and when you write a book like this, I mean, obviously the women that I've just mentioned are not as well known as Thomas Jefferson. They were, as most women have been throughout most of history, private people. But just because they led private lives does not mean that their lives were trivial or boring. People who live in the private world, people who do not engage in the kind of public power activities that we've come to celebrate in conventional histories, interesting things happen to them too. The cover of this book, and my colleagues who write books will tell you that we do not always have the choice, infinite choice over what covers we get to put on our books. This is a very sentimental image. This is a watercolor by a woman named actually it's a detail of a watercolor by a woman named Jane Braddock Petticolas, who is a friend of the Jefferson family. These are two of the Jefferson granddaughters down here, Cornelia and Mary Randolph. This is a highly sentimental image of domestic life at Monticello, and I will guarantee you that it does not capture the whole story. When Thomas Jefferson himself talked about domestic life, he liked to talk about what he called the tender and tranquil amusements of home, the tender and tranquil amusements of domestic life. And this ignores any of you who've lived in a house, right? Probably can, raise our hands if we have a domestic life. That would include everyone. You know, it's not always tender and it's not always tranquil. In fact, there's plenty of stuff that goes on at home that people mostly don't talk about. And you ignore the realities of people's lives when you idealize home life in this way. The women in this book lived with epic stuff. They lived with the grand stuff of history. They lived with terrible things. There was a murder of a slave and also a murder of a teenage master in the stories that I told. They lived with abuse and with destitution. They lived with fires and floods and pestilence. And oh yes, they lived through 2 revolutions. There are even pirates in this story. Now, second, they also lived with the kind of lies, secrets, and silences that we have a very hard time fathoming today. Now, I don't want to say they were the only people in history who lived with lies, secrets, and silences. One of the things I say in this book is that families are where lies, secrets, and silences go to live. Okay? So we all do this, but I want you to try for a moment to put yourself into the strange place in the past where they lived. So imagine for a moment that you are a woman who wakes up in the morning and you shake your daughter awake and you send her off to do her duties for that morning. She's got to make a fire for somebody. She's got to carry out somebody else's chamber pot. And in fact, the person whose chamber pot she's carrying out is her mistress, who is also her half-sister. Okay, so put yourself in that position. Or imagine that you are a young woman who orders her servant, her enslaved servant, to fix the hem on your torn party dress. Or maybe you are ordering her to deal with half a dozen children who are not necessarily having a great day that day. You're ordering her to fetch and to carry and to bow and to scrape and to take your orders. And the woman taking those orders is not only your own mother's half-sister, she's sleeping with your dad. Try to wrap your head around that, right? Because most of the women that Thomas Jefferson loved, free and enslaved, were related by blood. Now, of course, the best known of these women was ironically the hardest to erase and the one that they tried hardest to erase. So when I say to you the women Jefferson loved, what name comes to mind? Yeah, you know, we now chorus Sally Hemings. This is somebody that the Jefferson family for many generations did not even want to acknowledge that she existed. And they did so only very grudgingly. You know about the most arduously erased person in American history, really, Sally Hemings, right? And this woman, this is Ellen Randolph Coolidge, and she was Thomas Jefferson's granddaughter, and she sort of was a self-appointed custodian of the Jefferson reputation. And she called the relationship between Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings a moral impossibility. Couldn't happen, shouldn't happen, didn't happen, he wouldn't have, he shouldn't have, he didn't, right? A moral impossibility. Well, probably everybody in this room has lived long enough to know that there are many things in human affairs that are immoral, but when it comes to human relationships, there are not that many that are impossible. So Ellen Coolidge, you know, who you can see here, this is somebody who's going to be heading up into the Victorian era when she's going to be telling these stories. You know, what she called a moral impossibility was anything but, indeed, it wasn't a moral impossibility, as Kim alluded to earlier. This was not a moral impossibility. It was a family tradition. All right, so this is a family tree spanning 3 generations. This is the first time that the Jefferson and Hemings sides of the family have appeared on one family tree. And I designed the whole thing, and then HarperCollins had it designed up in a really nice way. But if you look here, we see here's our man, Thomas Jefferson, right? Here's his wife, Martha Wales. Here is her half-sister, Sally Hemings. Okay, so they're in the middle of this thing because John Wales, who was Martha Wales's father, was also the father of Sally Hemings with Elizabeth Hemings, who's over here, okay? So John Wales, he married and buried 3 wives and then took up with his half-English, half-African enslaved person, Elizabeth Hemings, Betty Hemings. And Sally Hemings was the youngest of their 6 children, right? So Martha's father and Betty Hemings had 6 children. Sally's the youngest. Martha was the oldest, and so that's 2 generations. And as it would happen, Sally's oldest sister, Mary Hemings, who is not actually John Wales's daughter, Mary Hemings, who's the eldest daughter of Betty Hemings, had a daughter named Betsy Hemings, who eventually will take up with John Wales Epps, who was married to Jefferson's daughter. She was the wedding present that went along with Polly Jefferson when she married Jack Epps, her first cousin. So, I mean, you could, someone has referred to the Randolph family genealogy as, if you looked at it, it would look like a tangle of fish hooks. And I think this is ever more. And what I say in the book is, you know, the trick of this thing, putting this thing together, is that anybody out here do genealogies? We have some genealogy people. You're never supposed to cross lines with genealogies. Well, good luck with that. And so after we finally worked on this, you know, I said, finally, I was like, they're gonna cross, we have to cross the lines. They have to cross. And that may be troubling or puzzling to people, but that's probably as it should be. You should feel troubled. You should feel puzzled when you look at this. So this is a family tradition spanning 3 generations of liaisons between Hemings women and men of this greater lineage. So, you know, another thing that I want to say, it's one thing to talk about when we have this kind of like, oh, the women Jefferson loved, you know, how many were there kind of reaction. It is one thing to be interested in people's private lives for their own sake. You know, whether it's prurience, whether it's we are interested in, you know, the backstory or whatever. But it's something else again to try to make the case that what happened in Jefferson's private life was important for his vision for the nation, was important for his legacy, was important for his greatest ideas, his greatest achievements, for the things for which we rightly celebrate him. And that is the case that I wish to make to you in the book and also tonight. He loved them. I'm interested in how he loved them and what love meant in these various relationships. But I'm also interested to make the case that his love mattered for his country. It mattered for his legacy. This is a map that I had made. It's actually the end papers. We don't do this very much anymore. It's a very old school book, and it has this end paper maps in it. And if any of you are interested in maps of women's lives, I wish you luck. We don't map women's lives, so I had this one made, and this is a map of the various places they lived. The forest where Martha Wales Skelton Jefferson grew up in, that was owned by her father, John Wales. Eppington, which is the place where young Jack Epps grew up and where Martha's sister lived with her husband, and where Sally Hemings and Polly Jefferson went after Martha Jefferson died. Verina plantation. These are all the plantations that where these women lived, including Poplar Forest way out here, Elk Hill Plantation, which was really Martha Jefferson's Monticello. All of these places, and something you'll notice about them is that they're very spatially apart, right? These are isolated little patriarchal domestic paradises, right? Jefferson wanted a landscape that would look like this. He based his vision for the nation, the Northwest Ordinances, the Louisiana Purchase, on an idea where you were going to have enough room to have these kind of protected households, these spatially dispersed farm households. He based his vision for the nation on an idea that he embraced and that was so significant to him and to us that it's all but invisible. Something that most of us would agree on. Something he would have referred to as a self-evident truth. I hold this truth to be self-evident. See, when a truth is really self-evident, you don't have to say it. Everybody just believes it, right? So this was a self-evident truth. And it was an idea, and I'm going to see a show of hands here, all right? The idea that in an ideal society, a man ought to be able to live a happy life and take care of his family. Please raise your hand if you do not hold that truth to be self-evident. We've got one feminist over there, right? Yeah. What about the women, said a ninth grader in Des Moines, Iowa to me, and I'm like, good question there. All right, so the idea that in an ideal society, a man ought to be able to live a happy life and take care of his family. But in this world, this is also, we know what's Jefferson's most famous self-evident truth. All men are created equal. He didn't mean to include women in that. For him, men and women were fitted by nature for unequal and complementary purposes. They were made for reciprocity, not for equality. Okay? So in this ideal world, the complementarity of men and women was grounded in the idea that men in this world would protect and provide for the people who depended upon them. And then in turn, women were fitted by nature to please and to nurture and obey. All right, so if you were living in according with the dictates of nature, and he was big on that sort of thing, that men would protect and provide for those who depended upon them, and that would serve the happiness of everyone, and that women would please and nurture and obey, and that would be where you'd be happiest too. You know, women are happier at home. So his vision of the nation is premised, I think, on the idea of these isolated, protected, abundantly providing kind of farm households, rural households, isolated, protected farms, as they are represented here, kind of little Monticellos, right? Which he imagined in the Louisiana Purchase from sea to shining sea. So this is a landscape of domestic paradises, of equal men, of powerful equal men protecting and providing for their dependents, which in this case include enslaved people, women and children, and women who are protected and provided in these places who are pleasing and nurturing and obeying and keeping the whole thing going, right? This vision required what Jefferson would have called a wall of separation between the private and the public, and he believed that when the private and the public came together, tragedy happened. You had to have separation between private life. In his life, it was breached 3 times, and I'd be happy to talk in unendingly greater detail about this. But in his life, the wall of separation is breached first during the Revolution, and that was because the British come roaring up the James River. They go all the way to Charlottesville, to Monticello. Cornwallis actually occupies Elk Hill, which was Martha Jefferson's place, and the family ends up having to flee down here to Poplar Forest. So this is a moment when his public life, when his ambition, when his career as a revolutionary impinges upon his private life, and indeed Elk Hill is sacked. And Jefferson took this as a kind of a personal assault, and it was indeed a personal assault. The second time that it is breached is during his presidency, when there is the scandal that erupts in 1802 about his relationship with Sally Hemings. The third time it is breached was at the time of his death, and I will have a little more to say about that. When I say Elk Hill was Martha Jefferson's place, I should just mention this was one of the surprises that came to me. I had never heard of Elk Hill when I began. Probably none of you all are looking at me like, was there something besides Monticello in his life? Maybe his mother's place, Shadwell, which is just up the road, but Elk Hill, what's that? Well, it was the place where his wife, Martha Jefferson, lived with her first husband. Her father had given it to them to live, not given it to them, but, let them live there. And it's this gorgeous site on the James River. The house isn't there anymore, but it's absolutely beautiful place. There was a lovely house there, up on the bluff and lands that were already in cultivation. And they had hunting parties there and so forth. And when her first husband died, the property reverted to Martha's father, to John Wales. And when he died, he willed it to another one of his daughters, but Martha made Thomas Jefferson buy Elk Hill for her. He bought the house where she lived with her first husband. Now that's love. People say, do you have any evidence that he loved her? I say, oh yes. There's that deed. Elk Hill property, Elk Hill plantation. And this was a place where she spent, if you start looking at where people were, an incredible amount of time. I call it Martha's Monticello because during the 10 years that they were married before she died in 1782, Monticello is a construction site. This is a place, it was 34 years a building. Twice. He built it twice. So you never knew when a brick was going to fall on your head at Monticello. It was not a comfortable place to be during their marriage. And so her place of refuge, and indeed during the Revolution, she is recovering, while Jefferson is off writing the Declaration, she's at Elk Hill recovering from a miscarriage that almost killed her. So these are the kinds of places where one can find refuge, and these are the places where they lived. Jefferson blamed himself for the sacking of this property by Cornwallis. He blamed his own ambition. When she dies in 1782, she had never quite got over the fact that Cornwallis had gone in there and burned the fences and burned the corn standing in the fields and slit the throats of the colts who were too young to ride away, and left them dying in the fields. And they rode back to see this. And he talked about it as a promiscuous raging over my property. And he believed, I think, that his political ambition had brought this on his family. So it wasn't just, she dies as a consequence of repeated childbirth. She was not good at bearing children, or, there were really two kinds of people, the people who could stand repeated pregnancies and the people who couldn't. People of the female sex. So he thought he blamed himself for her death, not just for the physical passion that had brought these pregnancies on, but I think also for political ambition. So he did not want to see the public and the private come together. And this is an idea that I believe he sought to implant in everything he did or wrote, from A Summary View of the Rights of British America, which was his first famous pamphlet, the thing that got him noticed and sort of got him on the committee to write the Declaration, through the Northwest Ordinances, the Louisiana Purchase, Little Monticellos from Sea to Shining Sea. Freedom for men, protection and provision for those who descended on him, or depended on him, I should say. And this idea underlies all of his greatest ideas. It is one of his great legacies to us. But one thing we know about self-evident truths is that they are often honored in the breach. It's very hard to live up to ideals. Ideals in real life are often quite far apart. And so when you see this as the legacy of his way of loving these women, I think what you have to also say is, love is a complicated thing. Love is not one thing. Loving somebody is no guarantee of security or prosperity or tranquility or tenderness or assuredly happiness. Love can hurt as well as heal, and even the kind of mundane things we do at home entail things that are not terribly tender or tranquil. Now, there aren't many documents left from Thomas Jefferson's wife, Martha Wales Skelton Jefferson. What there is, and this is from the Library of Congress, you can go and look this up on the American Memory website, and I suggest you do so. It's fun to do. This is a page from one of the only surviving account book that we have from Martha Jefferson. And most scholars who've looked at this thing, it's a celebrated page because they love this cute little doodle here, you know. They imagine Martha Jefferson dreaming over her accounts and drawing birdies on a vine, right? Birdies on a branch. Somebody, you know, the more tendentious of our scholars will say, well, you know, yes, maybe she's dreaming, but she may also just be tracing the watermark in the paper, right? You know, so you get that kind of you know, analysis of things. But think about this as an emblem of the tender and tranquil amusements of domestic life over a short period of time in Martha Wales Skelton Jefferson's life, because I want to ask you, what word appears most frequently on these pages? Killed, 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 killed. There's an awful lot of bloodletting in the tender and tranquil amusements of domestic life. If you're going to be feeding people on a plantation, lots of things have to die, and she is keeping track of everything that's killed, right? I had a literary agent, a wonderful literary agent, who is actually one of the extremely important people in the course of making this book happen. And I remember when she read the first draft of it, and she said to me, she said, do this many hogs really have to die in this book? Because I had a lot of hog slaughtering going on, and she said, you're going to be dragging your readers through it hog by hog. So I cut out a few, but I said, you know, a lot of hogs really do have to die here, and I want you to imagine Martha out there. She's not holding the knife. Ursula was the queen of the slaughter, who was her enslaved, sort of the person who took care of the children and took care of the slaughterhouse and the hanging up of hams, and was a goddess of hams, evidently. Her hams, actually, Jefferson had them sent to Paris, right? If you think about all this stuff he brought back, Ursula's hams went to Paris. Martha Jefferson is out there. Now, why is she, you know, halfway knee-deep in the bloody hog slaughtering, do you suppose? I mean, she's bartering with enslaved people. She's doing all these things. But she's making sure when those hogs, when they drive like 60 hogs across Virginia in the middle of January. Somebody does this. And then they show up there. She's watching over the whole thing because she doesn't want anybody making off with a hunk of her meat. You know, she is inventorying the important property of this place. So, I mean, she's not going to miss any of this, because part of what she does is make sure no one's stealing from her. Nobody who's working is stealing. So there's a kind of a disciplinary part of this, too, that lets you know that this is somebody who is a mistress of enslaved people. She's paying attention out there. So this is part of what goes on back there in the domestic paradise that we call Monticello. Well, what was love to Thomas Jefferson? You know, it's as sweet and pretty as birdies on a branch, and it's as brutal as killed, 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 killed. For Jefferson, love was passionate, and it's generous, and it's often really kind, but it's also possessive and insensitive and very self-deluding. And for the women he cared about, and from all the evidence that I could deduce, and Kim alluded to this earlier, they returned his affection to him. They were devoted to him. Love for all of these people could be as risky as it was rewarding. Why should it be any different for him than it is for us? Right? As risky as it was rewarding. He believed that his passion for Martha and his political ambition had killed her. And he might have been partly right about that. His daughter, Patsy, sacrificed absolutely everything in her life to make him happy, and I'd be happy to talk about that. Sally Hemings, as Kim mentioned, gave up her freedom for him and for their children. And they expected him, in turn, for what they gave up, he was to provide for them and protect them and keep his promises to do that. Now, I will say, in the case of Sally Hemings, Thomas Jefferson succeeded in keeping those promises. He succeeded. But in the case of his daughter, Patsy Jefferson Randolph, who was the woman he loved longest and maybe most, he failed miserably to keep the promises of provision and protection, because when he died, and he had promised her, you will be able to live at Monticello, I will have a legacy for your children, everything will be just fine. When he dies $100,000 in debt. This is the equivalent of millions of dollars in debt. Everything he had to be sold to pay those debts. So he leaves Patsy homeless, destitute, and absolutely emotionally crushed. Monticello has to be sold. Enslaved people that she's known her whole life get put up on the auction block. The family treasures are sold. All of those things, you go to Monticello today and you see some of which are reproductions. Many of those things sold away, sold and sold. All of this sold to pay his debts. He tried to save a little something for Patsy by doing something that was absolutely out of character for him. And he was so desperate that he did this. He did this because she was in already bad shape. Her husband, Tom Randolph, had already gone broke, had already gone through all this stuff where things are going up on the auction block. He's trying to save any legacy he leaves her from her husband's creditors, because the way the law worked at that time, if it belonged to you and you were a married woman, it really belongs to him. So what he did in his will that was so uncharacteristic of him was that he declared a woman independent. He declared his daughter independent. He made her a sole trader, a femme sole, somebody who's conducting business affairs in her own right for the purposes of this will, hoping that he could protect whatever she inherited from him from her husband's creditors. But the problem was all she inherited was debt. So, I mean, this desperate measure didn't work out. That desperation was a measure of his knowledge that he had failed her. And that failure broke his heart. Absolutely broke his heart. Well, this was a moment of enormous surprise to me, I guess, to find myself at that moment where he left all these dependent people so vulnerable, feeling so sympathetic to him. Because, you know, and all I can think about is people that I've known who made it their life's work to care for somebody. Men that I've known who were the patriarch of their family. I'm going to take care of you, and as they're less and less able to fulfill that responsibility, you know, you can see the crushing weight of that emotion on him. And so I found my own heart kind of breaking along with his. So what difference does that make, really? I mean, generations of historians have insisted that the story is really simpler than this, right? So when we think about a family that is composed of free and enslaved people over a course of 3 generations who have obligations to each other, and I said to you that Sally Hemings was the only person that he really was able to keep his promises to. What he promised her was that their children would go free. This, in return for her freedom, he said, all of our children will be free. He kept that promise. 4 of their children lived to adulthood. 2 of them were permitted to stroll away, as the phrase went, or walk away from the plantation. In one case, his daughter Harriet, he gave $50 to the overseer and said, put her on a stage and send her to Baltimore and tell her to have a nice life. And according to descendants of the Hemings family, she did and went into white society and, you know, sort of cut herself off. Her brother Beverly did the same. Their 2 youngest sons, Eston and Madison, were freed by virtue of his will. He freed only a few people in his will. All were members of the Hemings family. And 2 of them were these sons, one of whom has now been linked to a Jefferson male by DNA evidence. I'd be happy to talk about that. I want you to think about the fact that in keeping his promise to Sally Hemings that these children would go free, he's depriving his daughter Patsy Jefferson Randolph of very valuable property at the same time. There's no evidence that she opposed the idea that her aunts and uncles and siblings, because of course Sally Hemings' children are Patsy Jefferson Randolph's half brothers and sisters. I don't see her opposing that. I've seen no sign of that. But the money issue, I mean, They're living with this thing that's right in front of their face. Generations of historians have insisted that these stories be told apart. Annette Gordon-Reed has written a brilliant, prize-winning, MacArthur Genius Grant-winning book, The Hemmingses of Monticello. It's a story about the Hemings family that's over here. Generations of Jefferson descendants through the Randolph and Epps sides have insisted that, no, this isn't one family. These are two different families. That family, oh yeah, well, maybe they exist, but they're not part of our family. And I call this a kind of apartheid history. This is a family that lived in a house divided. These are shadow families that shadowed each other through many generations. This kind of apartheid history first tries to suppress all memory of the Hemmingses, although the descendants of Sally Hemings insist on keeping this memory alive in an extraordinary work of bravery that goes against everything that's the legitimate story, the official story, the celebrated story. And there is still plenty of resistance to what most historians who've looked into this consider the overwhelming evidence that these two shadow families were really one family living in a house divided. But I believe that apartheid history, like the laws of slavery and segregation that we have struggled to overcome, in the tradition that you guys in Kansas embrace so thoroughly. This is your civic pride, your civic knowledge. We have Free State Brewery. We are a free state. We are the home of where the Civil War began. This I heard from the guy who drove me in from the airport, and everyone since, you know, this proud history of overcoming, right? Apartheid history, like the laws of slavery and segregation, does violence to our country's history. And it does violence to us as a people. And I believe that as Americans, we deserve a better story. We deserve a complicated story. We deserve a story that is hard to tell, but it is impossible to deny. So I say to you, Thomas Jefferson had an interracial family. And so I would ask you, is there anyone in this room who does not have a complicated family? Why would we impose upon the most complicated guy in our history a simple story? I think giving up that simple story gives us something that is much better. Thomas Jefferson then becomes historic property that belongs not to a select subset of us who are better than the rest of us, but a founding father who belongs to us all. Thank you. I am delighted to take questions.
Do you want to moderate yourself?
I'm happy to have you call on people if you'd like, if we have any questions.
Could you go to the mic, please?
Excellent. It's always good to have mics out there.
I think it's on already.
Thank you for your research.
There we go.
I enjoyed the book very much.
Thanks.
And one question I have for you, I don't know if you addressed this in your book at all. Do you think that Mary, the oldest daughter of Betsy, Elizabeth, do you think that her older children were Jefferson's children?
You know, there is a branch of the Hemings descendants who insists that that was the case, that Mary Hemings, and those children were conceived right after Martha Jefferson died. You know, so there are some people who will say, well, you know, he found solace in the arms of, and that's really the official story of that branch of the family. I'm not sure. I don't know. I think it's possible. I don't know if it's likely. I don't know if we could do the kind of, you know, Y haplotype study on them to find out, but it's certainly a living tradition among that branch of Hemings descendants, of the Buckingham Hemingses, as they call themselves. So, Mary Hemings' older children were not freed, and her younger children, which was, and this, this is the complicated world in which they lived. One of Thomas Jefferson's best friends was a Charlottesville merchant named Thomas Bell. And he, while Jefferson was in Paris, Mary Hemings was hired out to Thomas Bell, and when Jefferson came back, she asked to be sold to Thomas Bell because they already had 2 children by this time. Robert and Sally Bell. I think it was Robert Wales Bell and Sally Jefferson Bell. So they had, Hemings and Jefferson, these kind of hybrid names, right? And so, according to her wishes, Jefferson sold him to his buddy Bell, who freed their children, and they inherited his property, and they all lived in a house on Main Street, and nobody seemed to have a problem with that. So that's a very different way of arranging this sort of relationship. There's this historian named Joshua Rothman who wrote a book called Notorious in the Neighborhood, which I recommend to all of you, which is about interracial liaisons in Jefferson's Virginia, and they figure prominently in that story. There's one moment where Thomas Bell is writing back to, writing to Jefferson in Paris, and he'd just been out to Monticello and had to have dinner. He said, "The family are all well." And you think to yourself, now who are we talking about there? So there are these tantalizing things in the record.
You're known as a historian of the West. Clearly, this is not the West. How did you get onto Jefferson at all? It's really off the beaten track for you in a way, in terms of research.
It is, but I'm going to have a kind of shameful confession, or it'll seem shameful in Kansas. It all started in Missouri. And because I'm a native of St. Louis, and I used to go and visit the Jefferson Memorial, which is now the Missouri Historical Society, and the Missouri History Museum there. And I loved Thomas Jefferson from the time I was a child. And so this was a project I had sort of been nurturing on and off, come back to and run away from and come back to. Once I became a women's historian, I wanted to know about his relations with women, his ideas about women, that sort of thing. So this was something that it took me a long time to feel entitled to write any book I felt like writing. And this same literary agent, Elaine Coster, who handled my novels, finally was never at all interested in anything I did as a historian. I mean, she'd let me publish with like scholarly presses and stuff. She's fine with that, right? But she finally said to me, tell me what book you burned to write, and we can make it happen. And it was this book. So it was a product of a long passion. But there is a wonderful book by a historian named Susan Kern called The Jeffersons at Shadwell, which is about his parents' house, his childhood home. And that's a book that's in the Yale University series for Frontiers and Borders. So it is about a frontier elite family and the ways in which their taste and their need for service and their their goods shed, their consumption shed, reorganizes a frontier area into an incorporated area. So there is some of, this is a post-frontier story, of what was then the West, I suppose. I'm cheating, but I'll try to make that case. But I have, at the same time, I have been working on these Western history projects. So Kim mentioned the Homelands book, and that's a book about that incorporates environmental history and women's history and Western history in ways that I don't think anybody's done it before. So I was trying to pull it all together in that one, and that's also from 2010.
You mentioned several generations of denying a relationship by the Jefferson descendants, but then you also mentioned there's a contemporary Hemings-Jefferson reunions, if you will. What have the contemporary Jeffersons, or how have the contemporary Jeffersons responded to your work, or maybe to Annette Gordon Reed's work, if you know?
Variously is the answer. I mean, when the DNA study came out in 1998, there were a number of Jefferson descendants who were really happy about this. They, at last, we don't have to deny this anymore, and it was a perfect kind of moment. I mean, we'd had years of prosperity. Bill Clinton's in the White House. We have, African Americans in positions of political legitimacy and power. So one of the Jefferson descendants went on I think it was CNN, and invited the Hemings descendants to come to the next Monticello reunion, the reunion of the Monticello Association, which runs the graveyard at Monticello where Jefferson descendants are buried. And so for several years, this was like a grand celebration, and it was like any family reunion, right? You go, you clean up the graves, you put fresh flowers on the graves, then everybody goes and has chicken salad for lunch, right? And then everybody goes home. But by 2001, there were some Jefferson descendants who had decided they'd had enough of this sort of thing. And so they organized basically a hostile takeover of the Monticello Association in an effort to hold a vote because the Hemings descendants were saying, well, can we be buried at Monticello? So some of the folks were like, I don't think so. The upshot of it was that there was, for the first time ever, a contested election, that the Hemings descendants were first disinvited from the reunion, and all of this took place through proxies. So there was some funny kind of, vote counting right about the time Bush v. Gore was going on. And, but the long and short of it is, they're now, so there's a faction of descendants who are against this, but we now have also, and if any of you are in DC, there's a new exhibition now at the Smithsonian called Slavery at Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, which I am dying to go see, and also new exhibitry at Monticello, where the wonderful senior historian at Monticello, Cinder Stanton, has done a lot of the scholarship that brings all these stories back together. So, and there have been, events orchestrated around that. So I'd say the jury's still out. It's a living thing. Yes?
Is this on?
Yeah.
I've read your book, and I loved it.
Thank you.
It was a relief to read your book after having read Dumas Malone's 6 volumes and Merrill Peterson's work, in which they assumed that Thomas Jefferson, at the age of 39, would become celibate for the rest of his life. And of course, you've taken a much more realistic approach. I am also impressed by the fact that in this relationship, it lasted 38 years, and I've scanned carefully his memorandum books and cannot find any evidence that he ever cheated on Sally. So I have concluded that it was, in fact, a loving relationship. Now, the tragedy that we face, by the way, I've met one of the descendants of Sally, Shannon Lanier.
Oh, he's the best, yeah.
He had something to do with encouraging the two families to get together, and so did someone on the other side, Lucian Truscott IV. But I told Shannon that it was my goal to move Sally up on the mountain because now she's buried under a motel parking lot in Charlottesville. And that's not where an unacknowledged First Lady belongs. Thank you.
Thank you for that very erudite comment. It's nice to meet somebody else who's been bitten by the bug, who's got that Jefferson thing going on. I have a friend who used to say, you just you flip the switch and my Jefferson light goes on, and I just can't stop thinking about it. I think you're right. I think it would be the kind of archaeology that someone like Fraser Nyman, who runs the archaeology program at Monticello, could do and has mentored with many people. And there's been a real transformation of the historiography, I think, really at the hands of Jim Baer and Cinder Stanton, who did the memorandum books, which was really the first monumental piece of work that reflects a Jefferson who lives in a fully inhabited world of a variety of different kinds of people. So I love those memorandum books, but they aren't for everybody. They're for Jefferson bug coterie.
I'm fascinated by the Sally Hemings story too, but nevertheless your title says the women that Jefferson loved. You've touched very little on his mother and a little bit on daughters. Can you, in a nutshell, could you tell us a little bit more about his mother and maybe his granddaughters too?
Yeah, I would love to. And I'll just say, apropos of the women Jefferson loved, I mean, one of the things that I explore in there is the different ways a son loves a mother, who can be often exasperating, the way a passionate husband loves a beloved wife, the way a father who expects to be pleased and obeyed passionately loves his daughters, and the way a master can exhibit love for an enslaved concubine, which, so these are not simple. Love is, it's really trying to unpack that stuff. His mother had been born in England. She came to the United States before the age of 6, as far as I can ascertain. So I like to call this a transnational history, which is a big term lately. She is the first generation of her family to be raised in slaveholding. Okay, so think about her growing up as a mistress of slaves. His grandmother had been the first generation on the Randolph side, her mother is the one who comes as an adult and is transformed from a pretty sort of woman in England to somebody who's seen as this very authoritarian, very daunting kind of rigid and tough woman, and I think slaveholding would do that to you. From what I can tell of her, and as I say, the letters have gone missing, so there's a lot we cannot know. But when you read the book, you'll see that, I find I'm using tiny pieces of evidence to try to deduce who she was, what she was like, how she felt about him, how he felt about her. This is a woman who made sure that money was laid out to ensure that her children learned to sing and dance. Dancing lessons, playing music, singing with instruments, that sort of thing. So, and also a woman who had beautiful and orderly gardens, right? So he learned his passion for gardening from her. And I think that tells you a little something about at least a part of her character, right? I think she also was somebody who, there's no evidence. I examined the account books from her husband's estate, in his own hands, in the hands of the trustees after he died. And the trustees ran it for 7 years, then Jefferson. There's no piece of her handwriting in there. So this suggested to me that she was the kind of woman who thought it was really good to leave the financial stuff to the guys, right? So that tells us a little something about her. Her prized possession was a Bible. I've seen the Bible, I've held it in my hands. That's one of those historian thrill moments, right, to hold Jefferson's, and you can do this if you go to the University of Virginia Special Collections Library. Those are the kinds of little fragments of things that I can know about her. The granddaughters, we can know a tremendous amount of things about, because we do have letters of theirs. These letters not only were saved, but they have now been put online. And if you want to know more about Jefferson, and I'm sure you've done this, go to the Monticello website. It is one of the absolutely best websites that I have ever seen about history. And you can click over to the Jefferson Family Letters collection, which is a collection encompassing the best archival collections of letters of members of his family, one to another, but not to him. And from that enormous corpus of stuff, what I found are these granddaughters who range from Anne Randolph Bankhead, the oldest of them, who's somebody who basically died died young of a combination of inability to carry babies very well, and an extremely brutal husband who certainly, the damage that he inflicted on this granddaughter certainly contributed to her early death, all the way over to Ellen Coolidge, who was a brilliant woman, and there's a new book out about her, but also the Victorian custodian of the story, so somebody who really is important in that way. And then his granddaughter Cornelia, who was single her whole life, having seen what having babies could do to people. That was not something she wished to have as be a part of her life. But who, after they are destitute, saves the day by deciding they should found a school. And with her sister-in-law, who was her brother Jeff's wife, they found Edge Hill School, which sees the family through some very tough times all the way into the 1880s.
I wonder if I could just ask you about something that came fairly early in your talk. You suggested that Jefferson's vision, very distinctive vision for the entire country and where it would go, rested largely upon his view of this distinction between the public and the private, and upon a set of roles which again were very distinctive for males and females. How unique is that set of views, actually? I would have thought, I'm not an American historian, so I'm on thin ice, but I would have thought that every founding father, practically, believed exactly those things.
I think that's exactly right, but I think the fact that we have it so well documented in Thomas Jefferson gives us an insight into one of these self-evident truths that most other people wouldn't have thought it was important to even explain. It seemed obvious to them. Right? We know that the way culture works is it's most successful when it goes on behind the backs of the people who hold these truths to be self-evident. So I don't think he was unusual. I think he was enunciating a zeitgeist, really, of his world. There were some founding fathers who deviated from that point of view. And probably the best known of them was Aaron Burr, who raised his own daughter, Theodosia, according to the principles of Mary Wollstonecraft, which is probably one reason why Jefferson thought he was a devil on earth. He had plenty of other reasons for that, but, the idea of this kind of disarray of proper natural roles for people, he thought Aaron Burr was unnatural for many reasons, but that was probably one of them. But Burr was definitely outside the envelope, and Jefferson's right in the middle, as you point out.
The 1804 election was among the most bitterest in the United States, and all of these personal things about Sally Hemings was raised by the Federalists in that election. How did Jefferson and any of the women around him react to not only the personal, but very much these issues being made major charges by the opposition in that election?
That's a great question, and it's sort of the Bill Clinton moment, right? How do you react, right? Well, the first thing he did was he said, I'm not going to talk about this. I'm not going to dignify these charges. He writes one letter, a private letter to somebody. He says, well, there are a lot of charges that are being bandied out about me, and the only one that's true is that when I was a young man, I offered love to a woman who was married to my best friend, but, that's the only thing I did. Well, so that was the Betsy Walker affair, and by that time it was like, okay, he's practically a teenage boy at that time. So it was not, but he did not directly engage the substance of this charge. He did send Madison and Monroe first. James Thompson Callender was the guy who basically published the scandal. And when Callender was first making noises about it, he sent Madison and Monroe to try to pay him off, because Callender had been his creature and then turned on him because Jefferson wouldn't give him the postmastership, right? Wanted a patronage appointment. Jefferson wouldn't do it. Callender was an out-of-control, crazy, alcoholic, radical editor. So Callender turns on him and begins publishing the story of Sally Hemings, much of which, if you kind of fact-check it, is right on. A lot of it is right on. So Jefferson won't engage it. He sends surrogates to try to combat it. Couldn't happen, didn't happen, wouldn't happen. And then the other thing that he does is he's in Washington at this time, and his daughters had never been to Washington before that. They refused. They had this separation, so they wouldn't go to Washington. So he calls me, he says, why don't you come and visit? It'd be really good if you came, So he wants her standing by his side. He wants Patsy and Polly both to go there and be in Washington for their first time and do the Hillary Clinton on 60 Minutes with Bill Clinton moment, right? He wants that. And they write back to him because they've never wanted to be a part of this. They're in the same world as he is. They see their roles, and they say, well, we really can't come to Washington. We don't have the right clothes. We're out here on the farm. We don't have decent shoes. We don't have decent shoes. You imagine Thomas Jefferson's daughters barefoot, and in the case of Patsy, pregnant for 26 years. Think about that image in your mind. And we don't have wigs. And we need wigs. And he writes back, he says, Dolly Madison will get you some wigs. I need you to come here. So they went to Washington, and that was, in the case of Polly, the only time she ever went. In the case of Patsy, she only went one other time. So that was their response. And eventually it dies down. He wins in a landslide because people only care about that kind of stuff for a while. I guess we now no longer care about it at all. We like to know about it, but it's not how we vote. I don't need to belabor that point, I don't think, do I? Yeah. Oh, here's
Please.
it.
No, please.
Oh.
I was just going to ask a question. Why was so obvious when you're living in small areas? Why would people be surprised that the slaves and the owners would all be, sleeping together and having children together? So I've always found that interesting, why they were so shocked that he had this other family. I mean, there's just certain amounts of places that you lived in those days, so why wouldn't you be having those kind of liaisons? Did you find that? I mean, I always found that interesting. Why would people be shocked? For heaven's sakes, how many people are living in this area, and how many people are you associating with?
Right, and how come her babies look like him?
There
Right,
you go.
that kind of thing, right? Well, I mean, you know what? When I was first teaching, or first working on this book, I taught a seminar called Sally Hemings, Thomas Jefferson, and the Cultural Politics of American History. And I said, the question in my mind, the burden of proof has been more than satisfied here. So the question is not what happened, it's why we care. It's exactly why do we care about this thing? We care because the right of one type of person to enslave another type of person rests on the notion that they're fundamentally different people. That there's something so deeply different about them that this couldn't happen. So this fiction is the linchpin of the entire system of human bondage in American history. So that's why they care. And, because once that dissolves, by what right does one person hold another in bondage? And the answer is, by none that we can recognize.
Well, they're all living together on this plantation to make it better, to everyone survive.
Well, one other thing that I thought about too, and if I ever get a chance, a hack back at this book, one of the things that I'd like to point out is that I realized that Jefferson was the only free male living permanently on this plantation. Yeah. He is surrounded by bondage, persons in bondage, and by free women, But he's at the top of this pyramid here, and other plantations have a much more significant presence of free men. So I think that his world is a gendered world in a way that I haven't even really properly, it was a women's world in ways that I haven't really come to grips with in here, so maybe that's an article or the sequel or something like that.
I just wanted to thank you for pointing out to me the common elements of Jefferson being termed unnatural, and this also being applied to his famous contemporary, Catherine the Great of Russia, who was routinely referred to as unnatural. Of course, too intelligent for her own good and all this and that and the other. But I also grew up with this very idealized image of Jefferson. I grew up in Williamsburg, Virginia, and people talked about Mr. Jefferson as if he lived next door. And they'd just been talking to him and this kind of thing, which was, of course, a considerable element of license there. Jefferson did not like Williamsburg, specifically the College of William and Mary. He thought was an inferior institution. But it's good to know that Jefferson, you helped humanize him in a very appealing way, so I thank you for that.
Thank you. Well, I think that he's no less extraordinary for being human. You can still go to Monticello and see all that stuff that spins, right? You know, the revolving book stand, the globe, the chair, you know, all of these ingenious devices, all of the product of his architectural genius, his passion for horticulture, for music, for food, for wine. So, you know, we can still appreciate that, but if we see the depth of the world that he's in, the complexity, the multiple identities that people inhabit, the ways in which they have to look away from what's in front of their face every single day, you know, that's a world that endlessly engages my curiosity in any case, so I appreciate what you said.
Do you think that when he gave $50 to that daughter, he knew that she was going to be entering, or he expected her to enter white society?
I think he expected all 4 of Sally Hemings's and his children to go into white society. 3 of the 4 evidently did so. 1 for certain. His son, his youngest son, Eston Hemings Jefferson, who's the one who is linked to a Jefferson male by the DNA study, went first to Ohio with his brother Madison, and they farmed there, and they were musicians there, celebrated musicians, both played the violin. And then he moved to Madison, Wisconsin, because Ohio is, you know, it's on the border, right? So he moves to Madison, Wisconsin, living under the name of Eston Jefferson as a white man, you know, and his descendants. So if you read Shannon Lanier's book, somebody was talking about it, wonderful book called Jefferson's Children, which is interviews with all of these various descendants on both sides who identify as African-American or Anglo-American in various braided kinds of ways. What you see is the incredible flexibility of racial identity and the fact that there's nothing obvious or self-evident or essential about it.
You are who you say you are.
Pardon me?
You are who you say you are.
Yeah. Yeah.
Any more questions? Okay, well, please do join us for the, please do join us for the reception and the book signing. Thank you for all your very interesting questions, but above all, thank you to Virginia Scharff.
Thank you.